Picture a guy who did everything right. He built a career, showed up emotionally, dated seriously, and genuinely tried to make it work. He wasn't checked out. He wasn't a commitment phobe. He put in the effort, and he still ends up sitting alone in his apartment at 38, wondering why he feels more rested now than he has in years. Society has a story for that moment. It calls it failure. It calls it giving up. It assumes something went wrong with him. But what if his nervous system is telling him something completely different? Because here's what most relationship content won't tell you. The pull toward solitude that millions of men are feeling right now isn't avoidance. It isn't immaturity. There's a clinical explanation for it, rooted in biology, in cognitive science, and in the psychological cost of modern dating that nobody's actually measuring. We're going to break down 4 of those explanations today. And by the end, you'll have a framework that finally makes sense of what your body has been trying to tell you. Section 1. The body keeps the score. Allostatic load and why modern dating is physically exhausting. Let's start with the body because this is where it gets real. There's a concept in stress physiology called allostatic load. It's not about one bad day or one major crisis. Allostatic load is the cumulative physical wear your body accumulates from chronic low-grade stress, the kind that never spikes high enough to demand your attention, but never fully goes away either. Think of it as a battery that recharges a little less each night until one day it barely holds a charge at all. Now, consider a guy like Anton, 54 years old, a civil engineer, widowed in his early 50s. He re-entered the dating market with genuinely good intentions. He wanted companionship. He tracked his sleep, his mood, his energy, partly out of habit, partly because engineers track things. And what he noticed was a pattern. Every time a relationship started to get serious, his sleep quality dropped, his focus at work degraded, and he felt a low-level tension that followed him through the day even when nothing was technically wrong. That tension has a name. It's called the walking on eggshells state, and what it does to your cortisol levels is not subtle. Cortisol is your primary stress hormone. Under normal conditions, it spikes in the morning to get you moving and drops steadily through the day, bottoming out at night so your body can run its recovery processes. But when you're in a relationship environment that feels emotionally unpredictable, where you're constantly reading the room, monitoring tone, bracing for friction, your nervous system stays in a low-level threat state. Cortisol doesn't drop the way it should, and when cortisol doesn't drop, recovery doesn't happen. Night after night, you're running on a system that never fully resets. Research on cortisol regulation backs this up directly. Men who have full environmental control over their living space, no unresolved tension, no emotional unpredictability, no performance required, show measurably faster cortisol recovery than men in high conflict or emotionally volatile cohabitation. The body reads a regulated environment as safe, and safe means it can finally do the repair work it's been deferring. So when Anton came home to a quiet apartment after ending his last relationship, what he felt wasn't loneliness. His body was simply being allowed to regulate for the first time in months. Here's the reframe most people resist. This isn't weakness. It isn't avoidance. Chronic allostatic load is the exact same biological mechanism that breaks down elite athletes who don't build recovery into their training. You wouldn't tell a marathon runner that needing rest days means they're not committed to running. The biology is identical. Sustained stress without adequate recovery degrades the system. And solitude, real unperformed solitude, is the recovery protocol. The difference is that athletes plan for recovery. Most men in modern dating never do, because nobody told them the cost was this physical. So the body's exhausted. But there's a second layer underneath this one that goes even deeper, and it lives in the emotional labor men are expected to perform every single day, invisibly, without acknowledgement, and without end. Section 2. The invisible tax, emotional labor asymmetry, and who's actually paying it. Most men have never heard the term emotional labor asymmetry, but they've felt it. They just didn't have language for it. Here's what it actually means. In a large number of modern relationships, there's an unspoken expectation that the man manages the emotional climate, not just his own emotions, the whole atmosphere. He absorbs her stress when she's overwhelmed. He de-escalates when she's reactive. He stays measured and calm when the conversation turns tense, even if he's exhausted, even if he's the one who actually needs support. And while he's doing all of that, his own emotional needs sit in a waiting room that never seems to open. Think about a guy in his early 40s, sharp, successful, mid-level director at a company that genuinely demands a lot from him. He manages deadlines, personnel conflicts, executive pressure. By any measure, his job is cognitively and emotionally taxing. But what he eventually admits to himself is that he expends more mental energy navigating his girlfriend's emotional state on a given evening than he does during an 8-hour workday. He's not complaining about her as a person. He's doing the math and realizing the numbers don't add up. That math has a psychological basis. Emotional regulation isn't unlimited. It's a cognitive resource, finite per day, depleted by use, restored by rest. When the majority of that resource gets redirected towards someone else's emotional climate, there's a real deficit left over. Not a character flaw, not selfishness, a depletion. Creativity runs low. The ability to process your own internal experience goes quiet. Recovery stalls because the system never gets the bandwidth to run it. And here's where the data gets interesting. Psychological research consistently shows that men in high conflict or emotionally asymmetric relationships report lower life satisfaction than men who live alone. Read that again, because the framing matters. Not lower than men in genuinely healthy reciprocal partnerships. That comparison would be obvious. Lower than men living by themselves. Single men, alone, with no partner at all, report higher life satisfaction than men stuck in relationships where the emotional ledger is permanently unbalanced. That's not a cultural commentary. That's a measured outcome. And it tells you something important about what the actual cost of emotional labor asymmetry is, not just in the moment, but cumulatively across months and years of running that deficit. So when a man chooses solitude, what he's often choosing isn't the absence of connection. He's opting out of a tax he's been paying without ever agreeing to the rate. Most men don't even realize they're paying it until it stops. Until one evening they're sitting in their own space, no performance required, no one's emotional temperature to monitor, and they notice a kind of quiet that has nothing to do with loneliness. Society looks at that man and reads failure. He couldn't hold it together. He couldn't make it work. The clinical picture reads it differently. He ran an honest cost-benefit analysis, possibly for the first time, and he made a rational decision to stop subsidizing a system that wasn't reciprocal. That's not giving up. That's self-awareness in action. Now, the exhaustion we've covered so far, the physical load, the emotional tax, both of them have a third dimension that most people overlook entirely. Because the modern dating environment doesn't just drain you emotionally. It's been engineered, almost accidentally, to overwhelm your nervous system on a sensory level. And that's a different problem, with a very specific solution. Section 3, Sensory Overload. Why the empty house is a biological requirement. Picture a typical Tuesday evening for a man in his late 30s who's back in the dating pool. He gets home from work at 6:30. Before he's even put his bag down, his phone lights up. A message from the woman he's been seeing for 3 weeks. Tone slightly ambiguous. Could mean nothing. Might mean something. He spends 11 minutes composing a 2-line response, second-guessing the word choice, reading it back twice. Then a dating app notification. Then a friend asking if he's coming out this weekend, which opens a whole separate calculation about whether he should keep that night free for her and whether keeping it free signals too much. By 9 p.m., he hasn't eaten a real meal, hasn't decompressed, and feels a low-grade anxiety he can't quite locate. He's not in crisis. Nothing went wrong. He's just been making micro-decisions and monitoring social signals for 14 straight hours without a break. Now, contrast that with the Tuesday he spends alone. Same job, same workload. But the door closes at 6:30 and the input stops. No performance of availability. No ambiguous text to decode. The nervous system gets something it almost never gets in modern dating. an uninterrupted signal that the threat has passed. This matters on a neurological level that goes beyond feeling stressed. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and emotional regulation, doesn't have unlimited operating capacity. Under sustained sensory and social load, it degrades, not in a dramatic, noticeable way, but in the way a CPU throttles when it's running too hot. Your responses get slower, your emotional range narrows, you start to feel reactive in situations that wouldn't have touched you on a rested day. This is not a personality problem. It's a hardware limitation being pushed past its sustainable threshold, and it follows you into sleep. Research on sleep architecture makes this uncomfortably clear. Uninterrupted sleep, without a partner's misaligned sleep schedule, without low-level tension that never got resolved before bed, without the body staying partially alert because the social environment doesn't feel fully safe, directly affects testosterone production and next-day emotional regulation. This isn't a preference. Testosterone synthesis runs almost entirely during deep sleep cycles. Disrupt those cycles consistently through noise, through unresolved conflict, through a nervous system that never got the all-clear signal, and the hormonal output drops, which affects mood, which affects focus, which affects every system downstream. Men who choose to live alone aren't opting for a lesser life. They're protecting the biological conditions that let them show up at full capacity, at work, with friends, in their own heads. The empty house isn't a symbol of loneliness. It's a sensory environment that finally allows the nervous system to complete its recovery cycle without interference. The broader trend is pointing in this direction for a reason. When the cost of constant availability is measured not in feelings, but in hormones, sleep quality, and cognitive function, the quiet apartment stops looking like a consolation prize. It starts looking like a deliberate choice made by someone who finally understood what the noise was costing him. Section 4. The intelligence of solitude, decision fatigue, and the high performer's case for living alone. There's a third mechanism at work here, and it's the one that tends to land hardest for men who consider themselves high-functioning. It's called decision fatigue, and it explains something that most people misread as antisocial behavior or emotional unavailability. Every decision you make draws from the same cognitive pool. Not just big decisions, every single one: what to eat, whether to take that meeting, how to word that email. The pool doesn't distinguish between a strategic business call and a text message. It just depletes. And by the time a man who's been performing at a high level all day sits down at 7 p.m., that pool is already running shallow. Now, layer modern dating on top of that. Early-stage relationships are relentlessly decision-dense. Do I text first or wait? How much do I share this soon? Is this going somewhere real, or am I investing in something that's going to stall out in 6 weeks? Should I bring up the thing she said last Tuesday, or let it go? Each of those questions feels small in isolation. Collectively, they constitute a second shift, unpaid, unacknowledged, and pulling from the exact same cognitive resource his job spent the first 8 hours depleting. There's a well-documented pattern in psychology where highly intelligent, high-functioning people consistently migrate towards smaller social circles and lower stimulus environments as they get older. The default interpretation is that they've become antisocial, or that success has made them cold. That's not what the research supports. What it actually shows is that people who understand their own cognitive output start making deliberate decisions about where that output goes. Cognitive bandwidth is a non-renewable daily resource. Once it's gone until you sleep. And people who take their work seriously, creative work, analytical work, leadership work, start to treat unnecessary cognitive drain the same way they'd treat any other inefficiency. They eliminate it. Anton is a clean example of this. 2 years after re-entering the dating market following his wife's death, he started noticing a pattern in his engineering output. His best work, the weeks where his problem-solving was sharpest, where he had the bandwidth to think 3 steps ahead on complex projects, almost always fell on weeks when he wasn't actively managing a relationship's emotional demands. It wasn't that relationships made him miserable. It was that the cognitive overhead of maintaining one consumed exactly the bandwidth he needed for the work he cared about most. Once he named that pattern honestly, the choice he made wasn't about giving up on connection. It was a resource allocation decision, the same kind he made at work every day. The lonely genius framing gets this completely backwards. Solitude isn't a symptom of social failure or emotional damage. For a specific category of person, it's a deliberate infrastructure choice. The same logic that drives high performers to guard their sleep, batch their communications, and eliminate unnecessary obligations. The man who lives alone and works at an unusually high level isn't lonely by accident. He's protected, something most people sacrifice without realizing it. Section 5. The Blueprint. 3 protocols for optimizing your solitude. Understanding why your nervous system pulls toward solitude gets you halfway there, but understanding alone doesn't rebuild the system. Solitude without intentional structure doesn't become restoration. It becomes avoidance with good excuses. So here are 3 protocols that turn the quiet apartment from a passive retreat into an active recovery environment. The first is a hard digital cutoff at 8 p.m. This isn't about discipline, it's about biology. Your cortisol recovery cycle, the process we covered earlier, needs a sustained wind-down window to complete. Every notification you respond to after 8 p.m., every ambiguous text you decode, every app you scroll through while lying in bed is a cortisol trigger, landing in the exact window your nervous system needs to close out the day's stress response. One trigger resets the clock. Do this consistently and you're not just tired the next morning. You're compounding the allostatic load that's already accumulating. The cutoff isn't a productivity hack. It's protecting the hormonal and neurological reset your body runs overnight. The second protocol is environmental design. Your home should be treated as a recovery lab, not just real estate you sleep in. This means managing the 4 inputs your nervous system reads most directly: light, sound, temperature, and visual clutter. Dim lighting after sunset signals the circadian system to begin melatonin production. Chronic ambient noise, TV left running, city sound bleeding through thin walls, keeps the auditory cortex partially active even during rest. Clutter activates a low-level threat response because the visual field keeps registering unresolved tasks. None of these are dramatic stressors. Together, across months, they prevent the deep nervous system recovery that sleep is supposed to deliver. You don't need an expensive setup. You need a deliberate one. The third protocol is the one most men skip entirely, and it's the most expensive mistake on this list. Before you let someone into your regulated environment, before emotional investment, before the relationship starts shaping your sleep and your schedule and your cognitive load, you run an honest audit. Does spending time with this person leave your nervous system more regulated or less? Does the interaction add to your allostatic load or reduce it? Do you leave those evenings with more energy or less? Most men default to attraction and chemistry and skip the audit completely, then spend the next several months wondering why their sleep degraded and their output dropped. The filter goes first, not last. These aren't the habits of a man who gave up. They're the habits of a man who finally understood what was being asked of him and decided to answer his own nervous system first. Your conclusion. Choosing solitude over a draining relationship isn't retreat. It's an evolutionary boundary drawn by a man who finally understands what his nervous system actually costs to run and what it costs to keep ignoring. The biology is real. The cognitive drain is real. The emotional tax is real. The quiet apartment that society reads as failure is often the most psychologically sound decision a man can make when the alternative is a relationship that never stops depleting him. So here's your challenge this week. Run the emotional labor audit. Track what you're spending: attention, cortisol, bandwidth, sleep quality. Ask honestly whether the return justifies the cost, not what you hope it will be, what it is. If this framework is clicking for you, the next video breaks down exactly how to build a dating filter that protects your energy before you ever go on a first date. Watch that next.